This isn't a birthday party, Daniel. It's an intervention. The words came from Margaret Carter's mouth just as her son stepped through the doorway carrying a small bakery box with a single candle stuck in the frosting. Daniel Carter had expected a normal family dinner for his 36th birthday, maybe a few jokes from his sister, maybe his father asking about work the way he always did, but the room waiting for him felt different the moment he crossed the threshold. The dining room lights were bright, too bright, and every chair around the long oak table was already occupied. His father Robert sat at the head of the table with his hands folded like a man about to lead a meeting. His older sister Emily sat stiffly beside him, eyes lowered toward the tablecloth. His younger sister Lily kept glancing at her phone but wasn't actually typing anything. And Sophia, Daniel's girlfriend of nearly 2 years, sat quietly at the far end of the table with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. For a moment he thought maybe they were planning some strange surprise, but surprises usually came with laughter, and no one in the room looked like they were about to laugh. Daniel set the bakery box on the counter slowly, the way someone does when they're suddenly unsure where they're standing. An intervention, he repeated, trying to keep his tone light, as if this were some awkward joke that would make sense in a moment. Margaret gave a small, controlled smile, the same smile she used when explaining rules to people who hadn't realized they were breaking them. "We're worried about you," she said. Daniel looked from face to face, waiting for someone to roll their eyes or admit this was a prank, but nobody did. Robert cleared his throat like a man beginning a formal presentation. Emily shifted in her seat, but didn't speak. Even Sophia avoided Daniel's eyes. The silence stretched long enough for Daniel to notice details he hadn't at first. A neat stack of printed pages in front of his father, another set of papers near his mother's elbow, glasses of water lined up like props for a meeting rather than dinner. Daniel pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down slowly. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the room. "Okay," he said carefully, folding his hands together. "If this is an intervention, I guess someone should start." Robert nodded as though Daniel had just confirmed the agenda. Margaret reached for the papers in front of her. Lily finally put her phone face down. Sophia exhaled quietly. In that moment Daniel understood something he hadn't expected to feel on his own birthday. This had been planned for a long time. Someone had organized the room. Someone had decided what would be said. And everyone here had agreed to be part of it. The cake he had bought for himself sat unopened behind him on the kitchen counter, the little candle still leaning sideways in the frosting. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked around the table once more. He had come here expecting a birthday dinner with the people closest to him. Instead, he was sitting in what looked suspiciously like a family tribunal. And though he didn't know it yet, by the time the night ended, 6 relationships that had shaped his entire life would quietly come apart, one conversation at a time. Robert Carter picked up the stack of printed pages in front of him and adjusted his glasses with the careful precision of a man who believed every serious conversation should begin with order. Daniel noticed the way his father had placed the papers in a perfect square on the table, each corner aligned with the grain of the oak surface, the same quiet ritual Robert used before starting important discussions at family holidays or business meetings. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and watched Daniel with calm expectation, as though this moment had already played out many times in her mind. Emily finally looked up from the tablecloth, but her expression carried a trace of hesitation. Lily sat very still, her fingers wrapped around the glass of water in front of her. Sophia kept her hands together on the table, her shoulders slightly tense, as if she had been holding the same posture for a long time. Robert cleared his throat and began speaking in a steady voice that sounded more like a prepared statement than a conversation. He said that the family had gathered because they loved Daniel and because sometimes love required honesty. Daniel listened quietly, leaning back in his chair while the words settled over the room. Robert explained that over the past few years the family had grown concerned about Daniel's direction in life. He spoke about stability, responsibility, and the expectations that came with being part of the Carter family. The tone was calm but unmistakably serious. Daniel noticed the way Robert's eyes stayed fixed on the printed page instead of looking directly at him, as though the paper itself held the authority for what he was about to say. Margaret nodded occasionally while Robert spoke, reinforcing each point with small approving gestures. Daniel glanced toward Emily, hoping to find some sign that she thought this situation was as strange as he did, but she only gave a faint, uncertain smile before lowering her gaze again. Robert continued, explaining that the family believed Daniel had been making choices that were distancing him from them. The words were carefully chosen, polite and measured, but the message underneath was clear. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression calm, even though he could feel the strange weight of the moment pressing down on him. When Robert finished his page, he set the paper aside and folded his hands again. Margaret then reached for her own stack of notes. She spoke with the same composed voice she had used when Daniel was a child and she was explaining rules about homework or curfews. She said the family had spent weeks discussing how to approach this conversation. They had talked about what was best for Daniel and for the family as a whole. Daniel felt a small ripple of surprise move through him at the word weeks. That meant this dinner had not been a sudden idea. This room, this arrangement of chairs, even the glasses of water placed carefully in front of each person had all been planned long before he arrived. Margaret continued explaining that Daniel had always been talented and intelligent, but that recently he had seemed unwilling to follow the path that would secure his future. She mentioned the family business, the opportunities waiting there, and the importance of staying close to home. Daniel slowly turned his head toward Sophia when Margaret mentioned how difficult it had been to watch Daniel pull away from the life the family had imagined for him. Sophia shifted slightly in her chair and finally looked up. Her expression carried a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty, as if she was only now realizing how serious the evening had become. Lily then reached for her own printed page. Daniel felt the room growing quieter with every passing second. The cake on the kitchen counter behind him remained unopened, the candles still leaning sideways in the frosting, and the faint scent of sugar and vanilla drifted through the air. Daniel folded his hands together on the table and waited as Lily prepared to speak, realizing that this conversation was not going to end quickly, and that every person in the room seemed ready to explain exactly what they believed was wrong with his life. Daniel watched as Lily Carter unfolded her printed page with hands that trembled just slightly. She had always been the youngest in the family, the one who laughed the most at holiday dinners, and the one who usually tried to keep peace when conversations grew tense. Seeing her sitting there with a prepared statement made the whole scene feel even more unusual. Lily took a slow breath before speaking, glancing briefly at their mother as if to confirm she was doing the right thing. Then she looked at the page and began reading in a soft but steady voice. She said that growing up, Daniel had always been the person she admired the most. He was the older brother who helped her with school projects and drove her to soccer practice when their parents were busy. She said that he had always been someone she believed would accomplish great things. Daniel listened quietly, noticing the careful wording. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, as though it had been edited several times before this moment. Lily continued explaining that over the last few years, she had started to feel worried. She said Daniel had become distant from the family and seemed unwilling to follow opportunities that were right in front of him. She mentioned the Carter family business again, describing how their father had spent decades building it and how everyone had once assumed Daniel would eventually step into a leadership role. Daniel remained silent, resting his hands loosely together on the table while he studied the faces around him. The air in the room felt strangely still, broken only by Lily's voice and the faint ticking of the wall clock near the kitchen doorway. When Lily finished her page, she folded the paper carefully and placed it beside her glass of water. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Margaret turned her attention toward Sophia Miller. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. Sophia straightened in her chair, her posture tightening as though she had been expecting this moment, but still felt unprepared for it. Margaret gave her a small, encouraging nod. Sophia hesitated before speaking, her eyes moving briefly toward Daniel before settling on the center of the table. She said she had agreed to come because she cared about Daniel deeply and because she believed honesty was important in any relationship. Her voice carried a mixture of concern and uncertainty, as if she was navigating unfamiliar ground. She explained that over the past year, she had often heard Daniel talk about wanting independence from the expectations surrounding his family. At first, she had admired that determination, but recently she had begun to wonder whether he was pushing away opportunities that could help him build a stable future. Daniel felt a quiet sense of disbelief as he listened. Not because the words were harsh, but because every sentence sounded like part of a carefully coordinated plan. He looked down the length of the table at his father, who sat with the calm patience of someone waiting for a meeting to reach its most important moment. Emily shifted again in her chair, this time leaning slightly forward as though she wanted to speak, but had not yet decided whether she should. The soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen filled the brief silence after Sophia finished. Daniel slowly leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. He glanced once more at the papers scattered in front of his family members, each sheet covered with neatly printed paragraphs. The realization settled in his mind with quiet clarity. This evening had not been arranged to ask questions. It had been arranged to deliver conclusions. And everyone in the room had been given their part to play before he even walked through the door. Daniel remained leaning forward at the table, his elbows resting lightly on the polished oak surface, while the silence stretched across the room. For several seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. He studied each face slowly, the same way a person studies a map when trying to understand how they arrived somewhere unexpected. His father sat upright with the posture of someone who believed the meeting was progressing exactly as planned. Margaret Carter watched Daniel with patient expectation, her expression calm but firm. Lily kept her eyes on the folded page in front of her as though she had already said everything she was allowed to say. Sophia looked uneasy now, her fingers intertwined as she stared at the center of the table. Only Emily seemed uncertain. She had shifted in her chair again, leaning slightly forward with her brow furrowed, the way she did when she sensed something was not quite right. Daniel let out a quiet breath and straightened slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured. He asked a simple question. He asked whether anyone in the room had actually talked to him about these concerns before tonight. The question seemed to hover in the air. Robert looked briefly toward Margaret before answering that the family had tried many times to encourage Daniel to consider their advice. Daniel nodded slowly, though he did not appear convinced. He explained that he remembered conversations about the family business and about living closer to home, but he had always believed those conversations were suggestions rather than requirements. Margaret responded gently that sometimes families had to step in when someone they loved was making choices that could harm their future. Daniel listened without interrupting, but something in his expression changed. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something closer to realization. He glanced toward the kitchen doorway where the unopened cake still sat on the counter, the single candle leaning slightly to one side. Then he looked back at the table. Daniel began speaking again, this time not asking questions but sharing memories. He talked about the years he spent working long hours after college, building a career in a different city. He mentioned the apartment he had rented when he first moved away, the small one-bedroom place that cost $900 a month and barely fit a couch and a desk. He described the excitement he felt the day he received his first promotion and how proud he had been to call home and share the news. As Daniel spoke, the room grew quieter. The tone of the conversation had shifted without anyone formally deciding it should. He explained that every step of his adult life had been about learning who he was outside the expectations of the Carter name. He had respected what his father built with the family company, but he had never wanted to inherit it simply because it existed. Robert listened with his hands folded together, his expression thoughtful but guarded. Margaret remained composed, though the faint crease between her eyebrows deepened slightly. Emily watched Daniel carefully now, her earlier hesitation turning into quiet attention. Daniel then turned his gaze toward Sophia. He spoke gently, explaining that when he talked about independence, he never meant rejection. He meant the chance to create a life that felt genuinely his. Sophia's expression softened, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. Daniel leaned back again and rested his hands on the table. The room felt different now, less like a planned intervention and more like a conversation whose direction was no longer controlled by the printed pages. Daniel realized something important in that moment. Every person in the room had arrived believing they understood his life better than he did. But none of them had asked him to explain it until now. Daniel allowed the silence to settle after his words. The room no longer felt like a carefully controlled meeting. The printed pages on the table suddenly looked less powerful than they had only minutes earlier. Margaret was the first to speak again. Her voice remained calm, but the tone carried more urgency now. She explained that the family was not trying to control Daniel's life. They were trying to protect him from mistakes that could follow him for years. She said that families existed to guide one another when someone could not see the consequences of their own decisions. Daniel listened with the same quiet attention he had shown all evening. When she finished, he nodded slowly as if acknowledging that he understood her intention. But his expression showed that understanding and agreement were not the same thing. He said that he appreciated their concern, but concern did not give anyone the authority to design another person's life. Robert leaned forward slightly at that point, resting his hands on the table. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who believed experience had given him clarity. He explained that the Carter family had built something meaningful over the past 30 years. The business had provided stability, opportunity, and a reputation that opened doors. He said that when Daniel chose to walk away from that legacy, it felt as though he was rejecting everything the family had worked to create. Daniel looked directly at his father as he responded. He said that walking a different path was not rejection. It was simply independence. The difference between those two ideas seemed obvious to him, but he realized that to his parents they might look the same. Emily shifted again in her chair and finally spoke without reading from any prepared page. She admitted that when their mother first called about the meeting, she had believed the situation was more serious than it appeared tonight. She said she thought Daniel might be struggling in ways the family could not see. But listening to him now, she was beginning to wonder if the problem was not Daniel at all, but the expectations surrounding him. Margaret looked at her daughter with quiet surprise, clearly not expecting that response. Lily glanced between them uncertainly. Sophia lowered her eyes again, deep in thought. Daniel thanked Emily for being honest. Then he added something that seemed to change the air in the room completely. He said that this was not the first time someone in the family had tried to organize his life for him. Over the years there had been phone calls suggesting job changes, introductions arranged with business partners he had never asked to meet, and subtle pressure to move back home. Each action had been framed as support, but together they had begun to feel like instructions. Margaret opened her mouth to respond but paused when she noticed the seriousness in Daniel's voice. He was not accusing anyone. He was simply describing a pattern he had observed for a long time. Daniel explained that independence meant making choices without needing permission, even when those choices looked unusual to the people who cared about him. The room fell silent again. The printed pages no longer seemed relevant. What remained was a family realizing that the conversation they had planned had turned into something far more complicated than they expected. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt heavier than anything that had been said earlier in the evening. Margaret Carter slowly leaned back in her chair, her hands folded together as though she was carefully choosing what to say next. For the first time that night, the calm certainty in her expression had faded slightly. Robert glanced toward her, then toward Daniel, as if weighing whether to continue the discussion or bring it to an end. But Daniel remained seated with quiet patience, waiting for someone else to speak. Emily was the one who finally broke the silence again. She placed her hands flat on the table and looked toward their parents with an expression that carried more resolve than before. She said that she had been thinking about what Daniel had just explained. When their mother first called her about the meeting, she had believed the purpose was to help Daniel through a difficult moment in his life. But listening to him now, she was beginning to feel that the situation had been misunderstood from the beginning. Margaret responded gently, explaining that misunderstanding was exactly why the family had organized this conversation. She said that Daniel might not realize how his decisions looked from the outside. Families sometimes had to provide perspective when someone could not see the bigger picture of their own life. Daniel listened quietly again, but this time Emily shook her head slightly before Margaret could continue. She explained that what Daniel had described did not sound like confusion or instability. It sounded like someone trying to live according to his own priorities. Lily looked between them uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. She had always been the one who preferred harmony, the one who avoided disagreement whenever possible. She said softly that the family had only wanted to help. Daniel nodded toward her with a small, reassuring smile. He said he understood that intention. He had never doubted that everyone in the room cared about him. But care could sometimes take forms that felt overwhelming when it was expressed through pressure instead of trust. Sophia finally lifted her eyes from the table and looked at Daniel more directly. Her voice was thoughtful as she spoke, as though she was reconsidering everything she had prepared to say earlier in the evening. She admitted that when Margaret first explained the situation to her, she had believed Daniel might be hiding struggles that he did not want to share. She said she had agreed to participate because she thought the meeting might encourage him to open up about something difficult. But hearing him speak now made her realize that the situation was not as simple as she had assumed. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around the table again, taking in the subtle changes in each person's expression. The neat order of the meeting had slowly dissolved. The printed pages that once guided the conversation now sat forgotten beside empty glasses of water. Robert cleared his throat again, though this time his voice sounded less certain than before. He explained that the family had never intended to make Daniel feel judged. Their goal had been to bring him back into the center of the family's future. Daniel answered calmly that he had never left the family. The only thing he had stepped away from was a plan that had been written for him before he had the chance to write his own. The words hung in the air for several seconds. Emily looked at Daniel with quiet respect, as though she was seeing him more clearly than she had in years. Margaret remained composed but thoughtful. Lily seemed unsure how to react. And Sophia sat very still, realizing that the conversation she believed would correct Daniel's life had instead begun revealing truths about the entire family. The quiet that settled over the dining room no longer felt like the structured pause of a meeting. It felt like the moment when people slowly realize that the conversation they planned has already slipped beyond their control. Daniel remained calm in his chair, but his eyes moved carefully from one face to another, reading the subtle changes in expression that had appeared over the last several minutes. Emily was no longer sitting stiffly with her prepared notes. She leaned slightly toward him now, her posture open in a way that suggested she was genuinely listening instead of waiting for her turn to speak. Lily still looked uncertain, her fingers tracing the edge of the folded paper in front of her as though she was unsure whether she should continue following the script that had been given to her. Sophia seemed thoughtful and quiet, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as the evening unfolded in a way none of them had predicted. Margaret Carter finally broke the silence again, though this time her voice carried a careful softness that had not been present earlier. She explained that the family had never intended for Daniel to feel cornered. She said the purpose of the evening had been to help him recognize how much support existed around him. Daniel listened without interrupting, but Emily spoke before he could respond. She said gently that support did not always look the same to everyone. Sometimes what one person called support could feel like pressure to someone else. Margaret turned toward her daughter with visible surprise. The plan had been carefully organized, and Emily had been expected to help reinforce the message that the family believed was necessary. Instead, she was now questioning the entire premise of the evening. Robert sat very still as he listened to the exchange between his wife and daughter. His expression remained controlled, but the certainty he had carried earlier seemed less solid now. Daniel noticed it immediately. For the first time since he arrived, the authority of the meeting was beginning to weaken. Sophia then spoke again, her voice thoughtful and calm. She admitted that hearing Daniel describe his experiences had made her reconsider the assumptions she had brought into the room. She said that when Margaret explained the situation earlier in the week, she had believed Daniel might be struggling quietly and refusing help. But now she could see that he had simply chosen a different direction than the one his family expected. Lily looked from Sophia to Emily, clearly trying to understand where the conversation was heading. She finally spoke in a hesitant voice, explaining that she had agreed to participate because she trusted their mother's judgment. She had believed the meeting would help Daniel find clarity. But she now realized that Daniel seemed perfectly clear about what he wanted. Daniel gave her a small appreciative nod. He said that clarity had taken years to develop. It had come from living alone in unfamiliar cities, learning from mistakes, and discovering what kind of life actually felt meaningful to him. Those experiences had shaped him more than any expectation ever could. Robert leaned forward again, but this time his tone was quieter. He asked Daniel a simple question. If independence was so important to him, why had he still come to dinner that evening knowing how strongly his family felt about the situation? Daniel smiled faintly at the question. He explained that he came because family still mattered to him, even when their opinions did not match his own. Walking away had never been his goal. Understanding each other had always been more important. The words seemed to settle across the table in a way that none of the prepared speeches had managed to do. For the first time that evening, the conversation no longer felt like an intervention. It felt like a family finally beginning to listen to one another. For several moments after Daniel finished speaking, no one at the table rushed to respond. The calm certainty that had shaped the beginning of the evening had completely dissolved, replaced by a quieter and more complicated atmosphere. Robert Carter slowly leaned back in his chair, his hands resting together on the table as if he were reconsidering everything that had been said. Margaret Carter watched Daniel closely, her expression thoughtful rather than firm. The plan she had helped organize no longer felt structured or predictable. Emily broke the silence first. She spoke with a calm voice that carried both honesty and reflection. She admitted that growing up in the Carter family had always come with a very clear understanding of what success looked like. The path had been visible to all of them for as long as she could remember. Good schools, steady careers, loyalty to the family business, and a life built within the same circle of expectations. For a long time she had assumed that Daniel would follow that same path simply because it was the one that had always been there. But listening to him now made her realize that no one had ever asked whether that path was the one he actually wanted. Lily listened quietly to her sister, her uncertainty slowly turning into curiosity. She said softly that she had always believed the family plan was the safest choice for everyone. It had worked for their parents. It had provided stability. It had given them a comfortable life. But hearing Daniel speak about building his own future made her wonder whether safety and fulfillment were always the same thing. Sophia nodded slowly as Lily spoke. She explained that she had grown up in a family where independence was encouraged from an early age. People were expected to make their own choices even when those choices were difficult. When Margaret described Daniel's situation earlier in the week, Sophia had assumed he was avoiding responsibility. Now she understood that he had simply chosen responsibility in a different form. Daniel remained quiet while each person spoke, not interrupting or defending himself further. The conversation no longer required defense. It had already moved beyond accusation. Robert eventually spoke again, his voice carrying less authority than before but more sincerity. He admitted that perhaps he had viewed Daniel's decisions through the lens of his own experience. Building the family company had required decades of dedication and sacrifice. It had become the center of his identity. Naturally, he had imagined his children continuing that legacy. Hearing Daniel describe his life outside that expectation forced him to see the situation from a different perspective. Margaret exhaled slowly as she listened to her husband. She looked at Daniel with a mixture of concern and quiet pride. She explained that her greatest fear had never been Daniel's independence. Her fear had been the possibility that he might struggle alone without support. Daniel responded gently that independence did not mean isolation. He had always known his family cared about him, even when their expectations felt overwhelming. What he needed was not direction but trust that he could build a life worth living in his own way. The room felt different now, almost peaceful compared to the tension that had filled it earlier. The printed pages remained scattered on the table, forgotten remnants of a carefully planned meeting that no longer made sense. Emily glanced toward the kitchen and noticed the small bakery box still sitting on the counter. She smiled faintly and stood up, walking toward it. When she returned to the table, she placed the box gently in front of Daniel. The candle was still leaning slightly in the frosting, untouched and waiting. For the first time that evening, a small sense of warmth returned to the room as everyone realized that the night had not unfolded the way anyone expected. Emily placed the small bakery box in front of Daniel and gently opened the lid. Inside was a simple chocolate cake with smooth frosting and the single candle he had bought earlier that afternoon. The flame had not yet been lit, but its presence on the cake felt symbolic in a way no one in the room had expected when the evening began. Daniel looked at the cake for a moment and then glanced around the table again. The atmosphere had changed completely from the tension that filled the room when he first walked through the door. The stack of printed pages no longer held any authority. They looked like reminders of a conversation that had already moved beyond the plan that created it. Emily smiled softly and said that regardless of how the evening started, it was still Daniel's birthday. Lily nodded in agreement and reached for a lighter from the kitchen drawer nearby. She carefully lit the candle and the small flame flickered gently above the frosting, casting a warm glow across the table. For the first time that night, Daniel laughed quietly. The sound was soft but genuine, breaking the last of the tension that had been lingering in the room. Robert watched the moment with thoughtful eyes. He leaned forward slightly and said that perhaps the family had spent so much time trying to guide Daniel that they forgot something important. Every person eventually had to decide what kind of life felt meaningful to them. Margaret looked at her husband with quiet understanding. She then turned toward Daniel and spoke with a sincerity that had not been present earlier in the evening. She admitted that organizing the meeting had come from a place of worry rather than control. Seeing her son choose a path she did not fully understand had frightened her more than she realized. Daniel listened carefully and nodded. He said that fear was understandable, but it was easier to face when people trusted one another enough to talk openly instead of planning conversations in advance. Sophia smiled slightly at that comment. She admitted that she had spent most of the evening learning something about Daniel that she had not fully appreciated before. His determination to build his own life had never been about distancing himself from the people around him. It had simply been about discovering who he was beyond the expectations placed on him. Lily leaned back in her chair and laughed softly at the memory of how serious everyone had looked when Daniel first arrived. She said the entire evening had felt like the beginning of a formal meeting rather than a birthday dinner. Emily agreed and joked that the printed pages might be the most unnecessary scripts anyone had ever prepared for a family gathering. The conversation continued with a lighter tone now, each person gradually letting go of the rigid structure that had defined the beginning of the night. Daniel eventually looked at the small candle still burning gently on the cake. Emily encouraged him to make a wish before it melted into the frosting. Daniel thought for a moment before leaning forward and blowing out the flame. The tiny thread of smoke curled upward and disappeared into the air. In that quiet moment, everyone around the table understood something without needing to say it directly. The evening that had been organized to correct Daniel's life had instead changed several relationships in ways no one had predicted. Some expectations had quietly ended. Some assumptions had been replaced by understanding. And the family that had gathered to confront one person had discovered that every member of the room had something to learn about trust, independence, and the meaning of support.